Society Matters.
I'm Bernie Furshpan, and welcome to HMTV at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center of Nassau County. I'm your host of Ordinary Heroes, and today I have somebody who is most definitely an extraordinary hero. I admire him very much. He's become a very dear friend of mine, and we work together with the Long Island Concert Orchestra here on Long Island. I'd like to welcome you, David Winkler. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Bernie. And by the way, I think you are really the extraordinary person. You know, guys like me, composers, we just sort of try to do our best, you know.
That's what all artists say. They all say the same thing.
What can I say?
They're very humble. But let me tell you something. You are a very unique individual in so many wonderful ways. You've composed many pieces.
Several hundred.
I didn't even know that.
You can only listen to one at a time, so really the number is not that.
No, but
critical.
it's a powerful statement that you've written several hundred. I think for the average person to create a composition which includes so many instrumentations and so many sections of an orchestra, to keep all of them in mind and write a story, right? It's like putting together a story, but also pull people through an experience, right? Almost like a roller coaster ride in a way. Right?
Exactly.
It's entertainment. It's a roller coaster ride.
That's right.
And you bring them to some sort of a conclusion. And that conclusion has to be moving. And your pieces that I've heard, like Pacifica in particular, moves me in such incredible ways. That is a very powerful piece. So I'm going to ask you a few questions so we can start some conversation here. When you step onto a stage, David, or you hear your work performed, now most of the time I've seen you sit in the back somewhere or somewhere on the side and just watching and listening to the performance and looking at the reactions of the audience. When you do that, when you sit back there, do you think of your music as art first or as a force for healing and connection?
Well, you know, it's really both. And the thing is that the first part of it is the connective part, my desire and my hope that the work will communicate, something of substance, something that's going to be perhaps, deep or profound. It's going to have an impact. It'll be something that people can actually, take away with them from the piece. When I begin to hear people, whistling parts of the work, even after a rehearsal, but especially after a performance, at that point, once I've communicated, I think it becomes art. So it starts out with the communication facet and then becomes, artistic once I've been able to make a successful connection with the audience and also with the performers.
For the moment, I want to ask you one question, and that is, how did you first connect with the idea of Symphony of Hope, and what does it mean to you to use music to bring people together across cultures and faiths?
Well, the Symphony of Hope idea actually began with Violins of Hope. That started several years ago when I collaborated with Violins of Hope, founder Avshi Weinstein, and he was able to come to the United States, come here to Nassau County, come to Tillis Center. He was able to bring with him 4 out of the 70 violins that had been saved, resuscitated, made playable from the Holocaust. And we were able to share these violins with an audience. At that point, it was only about really the Violins of Hope. And the repertoire that resulted from that concert had to do with the violins that he brought and the music that those violins played during the time that the interned were still alive, performing in the camps with those violins. That was the whole point. And the power, which is, I think, extraordinary, which emanates from that, everyone felt. And that was a fairly smaller scale event. We had just a chamber orchestra. That was an event which actually I did conduct, Brandenburg Concerto. It was the double of J.S. Bach, along with excerpts from the Beethoven Violin Concerto and also the Mendelssohn Violin Concerto with two magnificent violinists. So I began to get the feeling that larger scale music, maybe could come into the picture and make an even more powerful impact on audiences. So it began as a smaller scale event with 14 musicians and a couple soloists and began to grow from that point.
Isn't that amazing about these Violins of Hope? We just had a concert about less than a month ago at Malloy University, and God bless the people that worked there who accommodated us and partnered with us, and they understood the power and the message behind what we were doing. But during the day, we invited about 200 high school students. And weren't you surprised to see how meaningful this was to the students to see these violins from the Holocaust? It was a powerful moment for them.
First of all, Bernie, I want to congratulate you for having been, the energy force behind bringing all these schools together at the same time into the same place. This is not an easy thing to do, particularly, this time of year. Kids have various responsibilities, et cetera. But this turned out to be something that was really close to what they were studying. It was a kind of thing that had to do with, how do we relate to the world as a whole? Their teachers understood that. And one of the beauties of this event, not only they're learning about the violins, and Avshi explained to them the history of each violin, and also the soloist for the evening, Simon Zhu, performed on each of the violins to show that they could still be played as they were played, 75, 85 years ago during the Holocaust in the camps. But there was something else I noticed about that event, and that is the mindset, let's call it, the energy, the willingness for all these young people to be part of this event. It was very, very quiet. It was focused. It was friendly. I love the energy that these kids displayed after the event. They all wanted to have their pictures taken with the violins. Mm-hmm. They wanted to talk to Avshi. They wanted to talk to Simon. It was an event where they were not just ready for it, but they were really embracing the activity of something which was, a little bit unknown, but very, very human, very special and ongoing. So it was, it's relevant as much today as at any time, maybe now even more relevant concerning what's going on in the world. And so I was really impressed by not only the event, but also the fact that the young people were so how should we say, harmoniously connected to everything that went on. It was really inspiring for me.
They were moved. I was blown away to see their reactions to, first of all, the performance by Simon Deng.
Yeah.
And let me ask you a question about Simon. Was he selected by you or by Avshi to perform on these violins?
Well, as we've been talking about this program, where did Symphony of Hope really start? Well, I was fortunate enough to hear Simon in another concert, actually in Crema in Italy. The music director of Long Island Concert Orchestra invited me there. I wrote a piece for a virtuoso work for double pace and encore work. Simon was the second half of the program and played this really, really interesting concerto. I met him there. We stayed in touch. And as the Symphony of Hope program began to develop during the course, earlier last fall, I began thinking, well, Simon would be a fantastic solo performer. Also, he's very, very, flexible and welcoming when it comes to doing these extra activities with the Violins of Hope. He really caught on to the meaning of it right away. So he had been in our front view mirror, since the beginning of this iteration of Symphony of Hope. He was always there, and I wanted to build a lot of the program around him.
Well, you did a fabulous job because you orchestrated an incredible run of show. And I was very impressed and just loved to watch a master at work.
Well, I very much appreciate that. But we did have a previous run of show that you were kind enough to create for me in the previous iteration of Symphony of Hope. I learned from that, but also the program as a whole. I've produced over 200 programs out here, if you consider all the chamber music programs and, Long Island Concert Orchestra, quite a number of symphonic concerts in the past, since 2017, with the obvious absence of programs during the COVID era. But other than that, since 2020, 2021, we've been playing large-scale programs for an orchestra which is still finding its feet, so to speak. And so I was used to the idea of putting together, a program. In this case, though, we knew that we wanted to end with a heroic culmination event at the end, because really, ultimately, for me, and I think for the organization, Symphony of Hope is not only an historical focal point, but also it's an opportunity to celebrate. I really do feel that however dark, however dismal, however important in introspective ways the story of the violins happens to be, or even the messages we deliver about the Holocaust, ultimately, as an arts organization, as a musical organization, as a symphony orchestra, our job is not only to support that, but also to provide a step into the future. This means that we want to have these concerts culminate in a celebratory way. It has to be a positive message in order for us to go forward.
That was beautifully said. And I love the fact that you created a vision in my head that this is a bridge from the past to the future through the present. So this is a vehicle to inspire young people.
Absolutely.
That's what it is. And I really appreciate all the work that you do. And I'm pretty new at this, quite honestly. I've been involved in music, as you know, for like 40 years.
Right.
But this is a whole new area for me in terms of symphony orchestras and learning so much about it. And I really do respect all the talent. You have incredible talent in your symphony. These young people are really special human beings.
Well, I think so. And you know what? Not only the young people, which was amazing, but also every time we give an event like this, there's a certain amount of audience. This is new. That comes, say adults that may have a particular interest in one facet of the concert or another. Maybe it has to do with the Holocaust. Maybe it has to do with the concertos. Maybe it has to do with the music of, Brahms, Haydn, and the Messiah. So by Handel. So it's a mix of people. But I mean, I think that ultimately the energy, the message, has to be similar in the sense that they can all take away something important from the event and be as inspired as the kids were.
Yes. Let's do a deep dive into the Adriatica. It's a concert overture that you composed. Let's talk about that piece there. What inspired this piece, and what story or emotion were you hoping audiences at the Tillis Center, when we did that Symphony of Hope about 2 years ago,
right.
What did you want the audience to walk away with?
The whole work ultimately connects to a very, very important Judaic and Israeli folk song that has to do with hope being delivered over the lands of Israel. And that song, that's the beginning of the song. I build that into the work, and I allude to it originally only the initial motives, and then it becomes more elongated as the piece continues to its conclusion, and I build harmonic and contrapuntal support around it to create a more emphatic, more dramatic presentation.
It was.
Well,
it was.
That first question you asked me about, what strikes, what's the first part of it, the communication part or the artistic part? So in this particular case, I knew the communication part would probably set pretty well, would be absorbed pretty instantaneously. People, even if they don't know exactly what that melody was, they'll probably associate with it directly or indirectly. So in this particular case, I was more aiming for the artistic, the dramatic part of it. So I architected the work so that it had a growing texture, a growing dramatic kind of conclusion, so that the audience would know that I'm serious, that when you reiterate motives, when you reiterate melodic ideas, and you cast them in slightly different, keys or rhythms or something like that, and you keep saying it, with the orchestra, they get the message that you're really serious about it. And through the emphatic, let's call it a development of those ideas, you make a statement that people, they may not know exactly why it is that they're moved, but they ultimately will understand, oh, look how that has been architected. I think I really like that. And then it resulted in a really, really strong response with some ovations and things like that. That's what happens when you have the audience, really forefront in your imagination, and you're literally guiding them in telling a musical story, hopefully of some power.
I think of that piece like a train. You have the engineer, you engineered the music, you put it together, and then you need a conductor.
Right.
So nobody better than Enrico Fagone to conduct this piece. He is the most dramatic, incredibly entertaining, passionate conductor I have ever seen, ever witnessed. And the way he brought that piece to life, it was, I don't know if people stood up afterwards, but in my mind, we all stood up and praised not only the performance, but the quality of that piece.
Well, Enrico Fagone is first of all, international quality conductor, but also we collaborate a lot. Mm-hmm. So he really is, he has sort of like the front row center view of my work. And we discussed, my work as I'm completing it. We talk about, what is the best way to relate to the different orchestral sections. I tried to create a scenario where he can be, most effective, because it's a new piece, whether it's difficult, not so difficult, easy, whatever it is, it's still new. So to the performers, it requires a conductor who can really communicate all those features.
Let me ask you, how long is that piece?
10 minutes.
let's discuss your fantasy quintet. It was commissioned and premiered by the Berlin International or the Berlin Philharmonic String Quintet.
Right.
It is a remarkable milestone. What was the creative journey behind that piece, and how did writing for that ensemble challenge or elevate your work?
I have to say that the creative journey really began when I was writing my first works. So that's over 40 years ago. Okay. So I think that it's been something I've been somehow aiming for, preparing myself to be ready for when the opportunity arose. And, it's one of those situations. I had a meeting with a musician the other day, and he said, how do you get to be asked by the Berlin or even other orchestras to be commissioned to write a new work? And my answer was, I told him that the right person has to have the right conversation at the right time. And that's exactly what happened. And they had room on the program. They knew my work. They were confident that I would be able to create a work that belonged on the programs they were presenting, which included, it began with the Mozart Clarinet Quintet, and the final work was the Dvorak String Quintet with double bass. So I created a work that was a quintet for their full complementation, their full instrumentation. And to describe what it was like, I would say this. It's about as inspired as I have ever been to write a work. Nowadays, almost everything I write is a commissioned work. So I'm, it's a marvelous honor and a pleasure, privilege to be asked by one of the greatest ensembles in the world to create a new work. So I didn't have to worry at all about being appropriately energized to do the piece. It was inspiration from beginning to end. I wrote the piece really fast. I wrote it under a month, and I spent more time editing the piece. That is to say, making it visually, completely understandable by each performer than I did writing it. I spent weeks. I have an assistant in Italy, Filippo, who helped me to edit the work and also to make it as presentable as possible. He's a string player, and I showed it to some other people. It was to make sure that when the Berlin Quintet saw it, that it would be a friendly vision. That is to say, oh, well, this looks like, pieces that we played in terms of its presentation. And so there wouldn't be any sort of, there wouldn't be any kind of sort of interruptions or any possible blockades in the learning process. So I was fully ready for that whole thing. And when it came about for us to start to rehearse, it was beautiful because they were fully prepared. I sat down with them. We began talking about various things, and it was one continuous inspired journey for me. And as I mentioned to people afterwards, and I posted in various media, that week I visited the Summit of Music because I knew it was going to be quite good, but I really wasn't prepared for the pure mastery of musical performance that they've achieved. There's really very little like it in the world. That's really the top of the world as far as the performance of classical music. And I was, privileged to be a part of it, and also very, very proud that I feel that I fulfilled my mission, which was to create a work that belonged on that program. Since I was a teenager, my goal has been to create works that belong on the same programs as the masterworks. So I study the masterworks, and I try to create, to absorb their essences, and then through my own particular style and the way I do things, to create pieces that will have the same level of convincingness. So that was an instance. This last a few weeks ago, February in Spain, in Salamanca, and then in Vigo. Those cities with full houses and wonderful responses, and it was just a totally satisfying experience, and I continue to thank them. And it looks like I'm going to be working more with them, so that's doubly inspiring.
Your answers are kind of symphonic in a way. They really take you through a ride, a very visual ride, and I really appreciate the fact that you are what you preach and you are what you practice. So I love you for that. I just want to make a statement here that our concerts, the Symphonies of Hope concerts, don't just move people emotionally. They generate real support for organizations like the Jerusalem Academy of Music and Dance, the Long Island Concert Orchestra, and the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. And I'm grateful that these events show support for organizations that do incredible work. So my last question to you is, since we're running out of time, if you could compose one piece that defines the next chapter of humanity, what would it sound like and what message would it carry?
Well, it's a very dynamic question. And actually, the last part of it, the next chapter or the last chapter of Humanity, I would not go so far as to say that I'm actually going to be able to do that in every single respect. However, that's my goal. That's my aim. And I do have in mind, now that I'm also composing opera with a certain amount of success, the most recent work that was done last year, Rossini Perduto, is going to be produced in other venues now in less than a year's time. And I have another work in the hopper, as they say, about Lorenzo da Ponte, who is the librettist for Mozart. For my main, this ultimate project, I have in mind a tetralogy, a 4-opera scenario of a grand landscape having to do with the human condition, and ultimately, our strengths, our weaknesses, but more importantly, what we positively have to look forward to, what we can bring to the human experience to make most positive our time here on Earth, and also, which continues, if I may say, to ask the question, why? To me, the question, why we're here, why are we doing what we're doing, why do we have the capabilities to move forward? Why do we have the capabilities of destroying ourselves? I think the question why is pivotal to actually any creative endeavor, any artistic endeavor that's going to have a lifetime, a life, performance life, creative life. And so I intend to build that into this tetralogy, which does not quite yet have a title, but it will soon.
That was an incredible response. And you're an incredible human being. You're no ordinary hero, I'll tell you right now. I really highly respect and admire your work and who you are as a person. And I want to thank you for sharing with us the meaning behind the work that you do and the importance of what you do and the fact that this music heals the world and it unites people because it's a common language that no matter whether you're on the right, center, or left, it doesn't really matter. This is what brings people together. This is what unites.
Bernie, I want to thank you because you also are no ordinary creature. You are doing the work of humanity here, and you're bringing all sides together. You're spontaneous. You have no, there's no alter ego here. It's all about being positive in the moment, letting people be themselves, bringing the truth to communities for the first time. I really salute you for doing all that you're doing and also for making this wonderful series possible. I want to thank you so much for inviting me. It's been so much fun speaking with you.
I'm so glad you took the trip out here. You had to cross county borders to
Think
get
of that.
here. Yeah, that's quite a trip.
Didn't need a passport.
Not at all. I want to thank you so much for coming in and being my guest today. This was one of my best podcast episodes. It truly was. If you watch all of them, and I challenge you to watch all 520, but if you have time, I don't think you have a minute because you're always working on the next symphony. He's always working on the next symphony.
That's
I'm
right.
so proud of him, and I'm so proud to be his friend, to be called a friend of his. And I'd like to thank my audience today for chiming in and listening in on this incredible conversation with David Winkler, composer and dear friend of mine. And thank you so much for joining us. And make sure to tune in for more HMTV podcast episodes here at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center. Until next time.